Hi, and welcome to the Green Stacks podcast, Thinking Inside the Box. I'm Julia Hansen, your host, and I'm the Director of Business Development and Partnerships at Green Stacks. This mini-series on standardization and replication for modular multifamily projects showcases the learnings that we've had in deploying standardized unit designs across several modular projects, and why we believe that this system can lower costs and reduce barriers to creating more well-designed, sustainable, great multifamily buildings. Today, I'm here with Scott Vlasak of Bruce Ronayne Hamilton Architects. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you.
Scott is the architect of record for the two projects that we're showcasing in this mini-series, the single triple-decker in Cambridge, as well as the double triple-decker in Lowell, Massachusetts. And Scott probably has the most detailed view of how standardized unit designs can save time and money on the architecture and engineering aspects of modular projects. So before we get into those juicy details about our single and double triple decker, though, I would love to hear from you, Scott. How did you get into modular design? And was it with Green Stacks originally, or did you come to this partnership with experience in doing modular?
Yeah, sure. No, I had not worked with a modular project before getting involved with Green Stacks. I originally met Art and Gwen maybe about 10 years ago. And I had worked on projects that had used panelized wall systems, of course, pre-engineered wood trusses and things like that, but never, a fully modular project where the whole unit was produced in a factory. So I kind of was thinking it was going to be similar to maybe some of those systems, but learned it was actually a whole different
Whole
animal.
different animal.
Yeah,
What were the things that most surprised you when you started working with volumetric modular?
sure. I think that there were a couple things. One was, I guess maybe the biggest thing was how much time, up front in the design process you will spend as an architect.
Hmm.
Um, Making sure that every little detail is accounted for when you're working with a modular manufacturer, and because a modular box for a residential unit has everything inside it, you really
Hmm.
have to get down to all of the details. It's not just about the architecture, it's about coordination across all the disciplines, similar to what you would do on a typical project, but it's all front loaded into the design
Hmm.
process.
Do you feel like that front loading helps save time, not even thinking about standardized right now, but just having all of those details needing to be confirmed up front? Let's say you're doing like a one-off modular building. Is it helpful ultimately to have all of those details worked out earlier in the process than usual?
I think so. I think that it makes for fewer surprises during construction, like you might have on a typical stick-built project. If you're doing a stick-built project, there could be lots of adjustments that maybe need to be made because those items are not fully coordinated ahead
Hmm.
of time. So there may be mechanical or electrical changes, for example, that affect the architecture on a stick-built project. So you work as a team to solve those issues more or less in real time. Whereas in modular, the modular manufacturer is really they're doing their detailed analysis as they're preparing their shop drawings, and they're making you aware of those conflicts, before the boxes even get onto the assembly line.
Right.
So yeah, it is a very helpful project, and the more standardized units you use with a particular layout, then of course we would expect that those that saves time the next time
Right.
you use that particular design.
Right. Well, that leads me to the next question. And so you were the architect of record for both the single triple decker in Cambridge as well as this double triple decker in Lowell. So from an architecture and design perspective, how much of the original design of the first triple decker showed up in the second triple decker?
Sure. Layout wise, they were almost identical. There was very few changes. I think one of the biggest ones that I can think of, so for the first triple decker project, we had the benefit of a full basement.
Hmm.
There had been a previously existing building on the site, and which also had a basement. So it made it pretty easy decision to make a full basement under that project.
Mhm.
So we could put all the mechanical systems down there, anything that we needed for electrical panels, certainly the main panel for the building, the sprinkler system could, and the main controls could be down there. So in when we did the Lowell project, as you mentioned, it was a double triple decker,
Mhm.
and it did not have a basement. So we just did a crawl space, which we can still use for running a lot of the piping and things like that. But one of the biggest differences is at the ground level, we had to find a space to put the main electrical panels and put the sprinkler controls. So we had to just tweak the entrance vestibules a little bit to
Mhm.
incorporate, small closets for those type of things.
Okay. And if you had to estimate sort of like on a percentage basis of like how much of those between those two projects, how much was the same versus how much was different? Like what would be sort of your gut reaction to similarities versus differences
Sure, sure. So just to put a dart on the dartboard, I would say maybe 75% was similar
on a building level?
on a building level. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yep. And those had to do with, again, mainly the change to a crawl space. The fact that it was a double triple decker configuration and they were actually sharing a common wall. That meant that, of course, the two stairwells were what we put together, so we could no longer have exterior windows facing into the stairwell.
Okay.
So there are things that you have to give up, but it had very little effect on the rest of the building in terms of exterior windows that face into the actual living spaces. So
Hmm.
that was the nice part about it. And we had some other differences that had to do with Lowell versus Cambridge in terms of the exterior architecture.
Hmm.
The city of Lowell did, we showed them what we did in Cambridge initially, and there was a few changes that they wanted to make architecturally just to maybe fit it a little better into the context of the Lowell neighborhood that it was going to be going into.
Okay.
But other than that, yeah, maybe 75%, which to me is significant.
Significant, right? And most of that was to the building structure versus the actual unit structure that came in the boxes. Is that right? Or were these changes also incorporated by the modular manufacturer in the boxes?
Yes. Do you mean structural, like the structural engineering of it, or just
I
the
I
layout?
mean the things that you needed to communicate to the modular manufacturer that differed between the first design and the second design.
Sure. Yeah, no, there was very much the same between the two.
Yeah. And when thinking about sort of the construction of the crawl space in the second project versus the basement in the first project, that was a completely separate set of designs, right? Sort of the structural foundation of the building would have been unique to each project.
Yes. Yeah, the foundation was unique. That's correct. There's a lot of similarities in the way that the structural loads from the modular boxes are handled. So in that way, I would say there was a lot of similarity, but a crawl space foundation versus a full basement foundation, where we were retaining more earth with the full basement, that did change the foundation design somewhat.
Right.
That's correct.
Okay. Well, one of the selling points of using modular construction and introducing standardized design is the cost savings, which could be direct project costs or the costs that you get from speeding up the project timeline. Can you tell us a little bit about your perspective on, time and money was your office able to economize on using the first design for the second project with some modifications?
Sure. Yeah, so we were definitely able to save a lot of time, number one, going back to the layout. So because the layout had very few changes, we made whatever small changes there were on one side, then of course we could more or less mirror that
Mm.
to create the full floor plan of the double triple decker layout. I would say we were able to, on the mechanical and electrical side of things, in a similar way, we were able to economize that in the same way I just described for the architectural plans. In fact, a lot of times if you look at the mechanical and electrical plans, there's typically they'll do it in that fashion where they completely detail one side. On the Lowell plans, they'll detail one side, and then the other side is just noted to be a mirror
A
image
mirror.
of the other side.
Yeah,
Because in terms of the modular manufacturer, they can pretty easily understand that and just create it that way when they're doing their detailed shop drawings.
I see. So you were really working with a sort of like the design for another single triple decker, three floors, three
Hmm.
units, and then you were able to just kind of like press, copy paste, let's say, mirror it, and have the same details show up for the second part of the building for the other
Yep.
half. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
that's true.
that's really cool. Is that something that you see frequently in regular architecture?
Yes, I would say it would be similar if you were doing the project as a stick-built project.
Hmm.
You could certainly work that way. Um, yeah, in that way, I guess it's not significantly different, but as we're talking about with a standardized design, the more we use that, and the more we work with maybe even the same modular manufacturer,
Hmm.
that's when we can really talk about a lot of efficiencies during that design
Yeah.
process.
And so let's think back to the process of getting all of the details for a project ready, submitted to the modular manufacturer so that they can review it upfront before any construction even gets started. Typically in architecture and in construction management, there are a lot of submittals and requests for information that go back and forth between those constructing the building and those who have designed the building. Can you tell us a little bit about the process that you used for both projects, and knowing that there was one modular manufacturer for the Cambridge project and then we used a different one for the second project? Do you have any sort of reflections on how that process can be made simpler, especially when the project is a repeat with the same manufacturer, which wasn't the case with these two buildings, but is what we expect to be happening going forward?
Yes, so yes, absolutely. There's during that process of coordination with the modular manufacturer, there are a lot of questions sometimes in the form of RFIs, and there are also submittals to be reviewed. And those submittals can have to do with everything from the architecture and the materials that are being used by the modular manufacturer, and also have to do with the mechanical and electrical
Hmm.
systems. So, as the architect, we're responsible for coordinating all of those. So, as the submittals come in, I'll talk first generally and then get into maybe the differences between the two
Sure.
projects. And so, as a general process, we would, as a submittal comes in, we would decide who needs to look at that from the design team. Sometimes there are submittals that multiple design team members need to look at. Other submittals maybe just are for one discipline or another. For example, the countertops, as one example, we would not expect that the electrical engineer has to look at the countertops. Others, things like a light fixture, we would certainly have the electrical engineer look at that, but then we would, as the architect, would also want to look at that for anything that has to do with maybe a fire rating, if
Hmm.
it's going into a fire rated assembly, or just the aesthetics of the fixture to make sure that it's what we were asking for. So that's kind of the general process. So yes, there's a lot of that happens because the modular manufacturer, they're working from our drawings, but yet what they're trying to do obviously is make sure that it is buildable in their factory. So, based on their experience in doing this, they're the experts, and they can usually pretty easily spot some of the conflicts or questions that they might have to clarify what how the box should go together.
Hmm.
So yeah, on the Cambridge project where it was the single triple decker, it was It was a pretty easy process, I would say. The one unique thing to that project was that it was a passive house project. So there were a lot of the submittals that were pretty specific, and they had to be specific based on
Mhm.
meeting passive house requirements. So I would say maybe that was the main difference between the two projects. As we moved into the Lowell project, even though it wasn't a passive house project, it was still had to meet Massachusetts Energy Code,
Mhm.
which is very stringent, and still a very high bar to reach for. So we certainly had to pay attention to those type of things. But again, you're getting that economy of scale because it was a double, triple decker, but every submittal that we're reviewing is for both
Mhm.
sides. So, I guess as you were to compare it to maybe another project that wasn't a standard design, maybe you had a double, triple decker, but the layouts of every unit were slightly different. That could lead to some differences in the submittals
Mhm.
and maybe take a little bit more time.
Right. If you had to advise a developer who was thinking about using one of GreenStacks's standardized unit designs, either in the multifamily system or using the triple decker unit designs, and they wanted to sort of be as efficient as possible, what would be your biggest piece of advice for them from an architecture and engineering standpoint?
Sure. So I would encourage them to review the design up front and really, and we could facilitate this with them, have a really detailed discussion about the layout and really encourage them to put some thought into maybe even tour a previous project and make sure that if they do want to make any changes, that they consider those right at the very beginning of the process.
Hmm.
I think that's one of the biggest things that can influence that efficiency is with modular, the more you can have your design up front and stick to it and not make changes as you're going through that process with the modular manufacturer, that
Hmm.
really helps. Um, to draw that line in the sand and say, okay, we're kind of finished with the design
Hmm.
or schematic design phase, and we're moving into that coordination phase.
Got it. And speaking of the coordination, and you mentioned that between these two buildings, which actually did have considerable differences in terms of like the energy code and in terms of having the marriage wall versus standalone. What should developers keep in mind as things that architects do need to revisit for every single building, even if you're using standardized unit designs or even a standardized building design?
Sure. Yeah, there's a few of them. So I would say the biggest one, just to think about the way the building is built, starts with the foundation, right?
Hmm.
Because that's what goes in the ground first. So every site is going to be slightly different in terms of what's, what's under the earth. And foundation design has to respond to that. So the structural engineers, are always going to request a geotechnical report to get the soil bearing capacity.
Hmm.
It's always a good idea to understand if there's any unsuitable soils, if there's any maybe there's ledge under the surface, but close enough to the surface where it might impact a crawl space or a basement.
Hmm.
There might be groundwater considerations. So every site is going to be different in that way. That's certainly one aspect. I would say the other aspect would have to do with the local zoning. As I mentioned, from Cambridge to Lowell, there was a few exterior elevation changes based on just the architectural look and feel of the building and fitting it into the neighborhood. So
Hmm.
that's certainly something for developers to consider where they might want to approach the municipality and the planning staff to get feedback initially
Hmm.
on this is the exterior elevation that I think I might want to use, but are there any comments on it, or are there any written architectural regulations? And if there are, we can review those up front.
Okay.
Um, and maybe the third one to add would be energy code. That can be influenced obviously by the whatever state you're doing the project in. If it's in New England, it's going to be pretty similar between the different states, but there are some important nuances to be aware of. And then, as we already talked about, deciding whether the developer wants to pursue something more stringent than energy codes, such as passive house.
Mhm.
Um, that's important to know upfront.
Just a follow-up question on the elevation issue in Lowell. Were the changes in order to make the building facade sort of fit more into this sort of historic neighborhood in Lowell, were those just like aesthetic, like colors, or maybe like the pattern of the clapboard on the outside, or were they more like structural changes that needed to happen?
Yeah, it was more aesthetics and less structural. There was certainly conversations about the historic aspect of it. It was interesting, actually. Both sites, Cambridge and Lowell, were had previous existing buildings on
Hmm.
them. The one in Lowell had happened to have a fire, and the look of the original building was a consideration, I think, initially. The more we got into the details of the architecture and showing what we wanted to do, which was more contemporary in terms of the look of the building. The proposed elevation was more contemporary. I think the city warmed up to that as we showed them more three-dimensional views of it and how it would
Hmm.
actually look and feel. And yes, the colors were also part of it, but it more, I would say, had to do with the decision to you know, have a historic character to it
Hmm.
or kind of honor maybe some of the new um, fabric and the new urban architecture that was working its way into the neighborhood.
Got it. Okay. And so, Scott, our last question is really a broad and open-ended one for you. From your point of view as an architect, how do you think about this push to use more standardized unit designs, use offsite construction methods for all of the sort of efficiency and sustainability benefits that that implies? Not really how architects have been practicing their profession for many, many, many years. And sometimes we encounter pushback or concern from the architecture field that standardized design takes away the delight or the variability or the professional discretion of architects in this field. What is your viewpoint to that type of argument?
Sure. So yeah, I think that so I've certainly learned about a lot about modular through doing the those two projects that we're talking about today.
Hmm.
There's also another Green Stacks project that we didn't talk a lot about today, but that I'll kind of use to illustrate my answer to your question.
Sure.
Um, and that's 28 Austin Street in Newton. And so in terms of yeah, the delight of architecture and maybe the stigma that modular is has to be that the standardization actually kind of governs the end result of the architecture. I've definitely found that to not be true. There's a lot of things that you can do with standardized designs that still can give the building a unique look, and so you're always able to, as an architect, give that building whatever appearance you'd like it to.
Mm-hmm.
There are always going to be those aspects of modular construction that you have to, the constraints you have to work within. Some of them are structural. Um, we didn't really get into the details today about the effect that stacking the boxes has. You end up with a very thick floor ceiling
Mm-hmm.
assembly between floors, and that has pluses and minuses as well, right? There's a lot of acoustic benefits to that. There's a lot of fire rating
Hmm.
benefits to that. It does tend to have you carefully think about your ceiling heights, though. So those are some of the aspects. But the 28 Austin Street project, the reason why I brought that up in answer to your question is I feel like if you look at that building, you would never really know that it's uses modular boxes. And the way we were able to achieve that look, that building has retail use on the ground floor, and the wood frame starts above
Hmm.
that for the modular construction. And but we were able to push and pull the boxes in unique ways to create plane changes. And we were also doing a lot of different varied material changes on the exterior. So it really creates a nice streetscape presentation on the urban facades that you really, like I said, would never know that it was modular versus a stick built project. So I think that modular, it definitely still has that ability to there's no need or no reason why a modular building has to look a certain way.
Mhm.
But I think that like you said, that perception may be out there, and I think it's something that we have to, continue to hopefully just address and make it clear to developers and architects who maybe are unfamiliar.
And what about the next discussion point that often comes up of modular construction and standardized designs sort of eating away at the viability of architects' profession? Do you feel like that's a risk um, to
No, I don't, because the way I look at it is, you're putting together a puzzle, and you'll always need the architects and the other design professionals, the other engineers, to put that puzzle together. So the standardized units are a great tool that architects and the design team can use, but ultimately they still have to be put together into a building that's fully
Mhm.
functional. So if you're dealing with, a triple decker building, that's one design problem. And if you're dealing with a multifamily building using modular standardized units, that can be much more complex,
Mhm.
right? Because now you've got interior hallways to deal with, and you've got stairways and elevators, and maybe some mixed use on the ground floor, that you're all, coordinating that into one building design. So even though you're reusing the standardized units, that's maybe the time saving part, but there's
Mhm.
still a lot for the architecture and design team to
Yeah.
to tackle.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for your time. This has been a really fascinating conversation for me, and I always enjoy learning more about the viewpoint of some of the professionals that we work with on our projects. So, thanks so much for sharing your unique perspective here on the.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Thinking Inside the Box, a podcast from Green Stacks. Please remember to subscribe if you like this episode and leave any comments or questions. The future is modular.